This is a method of hand making a shirt. It is almost completely sewn with machine, a little bit ironically, and it will have no raw or overlocked edges. You could describe it as a bespoke method, though it's only a bespoke shirt because the pattern was specifically cut and made for me. I am using denim just because it has a right side and a wrong side, plus it's a very stable fabric that makes it a bit easier to sew with, making the video a bit less frustrating to make. The type of shirt I'm making here has a single cuff, and the collar I'm making will use collar stays. Hang on. Such as these, the removable kind. Even though it is a denim shirt, it's not something you'd typically expect to make with that cloth, but I wanted to share, well, this method of making a collar stay housing, which, I don't know what to call it, I'm just going with it. I'm using a non-fusible interfacing, but that can easily be substituted. Cloth-wise, you barely need 2 meters, basically just the height of the front body and the height of the sleeve put together, and then everything else just fits into place, falls into place. An important note with this professional method is that it is generally used with such fine cloths that marks and pins become a permanent feature, basically. A bespoke shirt has to be made with perfect patterns, skills, and precise measurements without any crutches, clips, or basting. Methods of shirt making can be very pick and mix. There are many ways to do each step and a lot of leeway in the general order of the steps as well. What I'm sharing is just one potential workflow with one potential set of methods. For example, I did make this Raj pattern shirt using a lot of the same techniques. It was a bit of a disaster, but otherwise, this is a video on bespoke shirt making. The pattern I'm using has the front edge line drawn down the front of the pattern, with the appropriate inlay for the placket I want. I like a plain front placket, and I apparently have a specific way of making it. So the front edge is marked on the pattern, and I have about 13 centimeters, 5 inches in front of it, and I am making use of the selvage. You have to know what your pattern includes and how much cloth you need for the placket that you want. Tracing the perimeter with chalk, which has its own variations, which I will bring up again in a moment. The pattern is laid with the front piece towards the selvage edge and the back piece on the fold at the same level. The sleeve is placed below the front piece so that the fold of the cloth can be used for other things in some cases. As it is placed against the selvage, it doesn't need to measure the grain, but I know it is on the straight and I know the exact amount of inlay I have and what to do with it. I'm using the ruler to hold the paper in place just because it's very soft and easy to push out of the way. The ruler gives me stability when chalking around it. This pattern has a drop right shoulder, which means there's an alteration to the front and back pieces only. At the shoulder, marking 1.2 centimeters, half an inch, below the shoulder at the armhole, and the armhole at the side seam. It is similar on the back piece, except it is the yoke seam that is dropped by the shoulder as well as the bottom of the armhole. In both cases, the pattern should be used to trace the armhole again between the new points. And because I am chalking on the right hand side pieces, I can mark the drops. If it were on the left, it shouldn't be drawn on because it wouldn't come out. Theoretically, I shouldn't write drop right on the cloth either because it wouldn't come out later, but I did anyway. Same reason, there aren't any interior marks or balance points. Similar to the front, the back piece doesn't need to be measured because it is placed onto the fold to be cut around. Again, I would place the sleeve by the selvage, but I didn't need the fold and it sits higher up on the cloth underneath the back. The sleeve has a center line, so I measure that from the edge to make sure it's on the straight grain. There is the line on the rear side to add the gauntlet. Any other cloth, I would make a pencil point at the end of the line and at the cuff so that I can use to find the line later. I have one cuff pattern, but there are two sizes for the left and right wrist. I put that down on the grain anywhere they'll fit, tracing out the two cuffs. I shouldn't need to mark which is which, but I do for clarity. The gauntlet pieces also need to be cut. I have accidentally used the wrong template here, but I have the correct one when I sew the gauntlet onto the sleeve. Cutting the yoke, there are two ways, either a split yoke or a single piece. I have it patterned as both possible options. A split yoke is cut so that one of the yokes will be on the straight grain and the other piece is placed so that the shoulder seams are on the same line, which I am now thinking is not the correct method. No, yes it is. I've just rotated it 90 degrees for some reason. So there would be 4 cut in total, and they are given a seam in the middle before being used. The whole yoke is cut down the warp grain as well, so I'm putting it up to the selvage to save measuring. The whole yoke folded in half is 1 seam allowance smaller than the split yokes because it doesn't need to be sewn in the middle, of course. In the case of the whole yoke, I need to mark the center points of the back neck and the seam for the back so that it can be sewn together accurately. Lastly, the stand and fall of the collar. Both of them are cut on the warp of the cloth to measure and make sure they're on the warp so that they can be measured on either side from the selvage or the fold. These also both need to have the center points marked to be sewn together. Depending on the type of collar that's being made, it's possible that a third piece of the full needs to be cut. The exact way the collar is being constructed here only needs to be 2 pieces. The cloth can then all be cut out. Here I'll introduce a discussion on how a shirt can or should be cut. From one London shirtmaker, I'm told the industry standard is using a rotary cutter and cutting mats. The pattern is weighted onto the cloth with numerous weights, enough weights to weigh the entire pattern down at once, which is then cut out without making any marks on the cloth. In a similar sense, knives or scalpels can also be used. In other cases, a sharp or fine pencil can be used to trace the pattern onto the cloth before cutting. Friction pens are also very good because the ink becomes invisible in heat. Another feature of this is cutting several pieces of cloth out at once. Similar to using a specialized bandsaw to cut hundreds of patterns at once, just on a smaller scale. Like in production, bespoke shirts are made with precise patterns that are cut and sewn together based on exact measures and seams. Cutting like this is potentially better because it's faster. It skips the steps of tracing around the pattern and only requires extra weights. It is also much more reliable for cutting extra layers of cloth at once. If you have scissors, it's going to pull up the layers and probably offset them quite a bit. Personally, I don't like the idea of rotary cutters or other knives to cut cloth, only because I've been a tailor for a little while and I've always used scissors. And for a slightly shorter amount of time, I have had the mantra of never placing my scissors beyond where I intend to cut. It's less possible with a tool other than scissors. It also requires a very large cutting mat, which, curiously, the LCF quartermasters, or however they were called, denied the class on shirt making any cutting mats because they didn't want us using them. There's a level of efficiency we use when using scissors, but then it also requires less equipment overall. It can depend what you have access to and what you would prefer to use. So with that, I have cut out the shirt in any case. As stated, there is a drop right on the pattern. Since, almost by coincidence, both marks are on the right hand side of the shirt, I can cut them off of the mark made. If I didn't have the marks, or the pattern, I could use the other side that didn't have the drop as a template to drop the armhole accurately, as can be seen here. The center of the back where the yoke will be sewn on needs to be notched so that the yoke can be sewn on. Same for all of the pieces that have a center mark. They need a tiny snip into the cloth to copy it onto both pieces without leaving a permanent or visible mark. Or rather, visible permanent mark. With all the pieces, I want to take the cuffs, stand and fall of the collar to cut the canvas. As indicated, I'm using a non-fusible interfacing here. Because I don't know how stable this interfacing is, i.e. if it shrinks at all, I want to soak it just in case. This way it won't change size after it's been made and gets washed. So I cut vaguely around the 4 pieces with a warm tub of water, leaving the pieces in there for around 10 minutes and then hanging them up to dry. Any shrinkage should be taken out of them then, and they'll be cut out the exact size of the 4 pieces when I need them. For my method of sewing a plain placket, I begin with folding over the cloth on the front to give me the front edge. Because of the exact amount of cloth that was left, I know that I can fold 7.5 centimeters over, and that should be ironed and creased to give me the front edge, which will be about 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 in front of the center front, for about a 3 centimeter, 1.25 inch wide placket. Folding it down the same way the whole way down the front. Afterwards, folding the remainder almost in half so that the raw edge is hidden away. I can also fold over a seam allowance so that it fits inside of the fold in the front edge and there can be no exposed raw edges. There is a stitch down the edge of the folded seam allowance inside next to the front edge. This keeps the front clean and the raw edge of the front can't be exposed. The yoke goes onto the back very easily. If it is a split yoke, then the 2 halves need to be sewn together first with the appropriate seam allowance, generally a 1/4 inch, about a good 1/2 centimeter, and then the seam pressed open. Both yokes get sewn on at once, and if there's an inside and an outside, for example, if there's a label, that goes right side of the yoke to the wrong side of the back, so that the right sides of the yoke are sandwiching the back with the center notches all lining up. The yoke is a little wider than the back in my case. I didn't make this pattern and I wasn't told about any ease across the yoke or the shoulder, so I will line up the center marks and sew them onto the back net. I'll just cut off the excess. At the machine, sewing the placket as previously described. It can't be pinned or basted in any way. The stitch length should generally be much smaller than is typically used, as it's a slightly exposed stitch. In my case, I think it was luck that the tension and pull of the cloth under the machine was even this time and didn't cause any twisting, which I would usually rely on pins or basting to save me from, though this is part of the skill involved in sewing shirts, putting it through the machine carefully like that. Doing both fronts, and then I move on to the back. Checking the center notches and moving towards the side that I want to begin machining. Again, the yokes overshoot the back a little, but that's fine for now. With the raw edges of the seam together, I'm using the seam allowance since I know that I know the pattern has. In this case, 1/4 inch, a good 1/2 centimeter. Making sure I'm not holding the cloth tightly or accidentally easing anything in so that the notches are still lined up when I get there and on to the other side. The seam gets top stitched, usually so that it's visible on the outside. The outer yoke is folded up and pulled taut, placing it under the machine again. It can be sewn any distance from the edge. Here I'm sewing it on the edge. The whole way making sure the seam is pulled open. This reduces the need to press it and to keep it pressed as it gets washed. With the front and back prepped, the shoulder seams can be sewn, though at this point any embroidery on the front or a pocket could be added as well. You can use any method. I think there are a couple that are popular, but I will add the one I like to use at the moment. Before sewing, iron over a small seam allowance on the shoulders of the yoke on the right side of the back, so we're not doing anything to the inside yoke yet. Lay the fronts onto the back as it will be when it's finished, so wrong side to wrong side, so that the left and right shoulders are together, folding away the outer yoke and placing the seams of the front shoulders to the inside yoke. These will be sewn with the seam allowance of the pattern, 1/2 centimeter, about 1/4 of an inch. As before, the yoke is slightly wide, so I'm ensuring the neck points are together and the shoulders are offset slightly, sewn together like that. With both shoulders sewn here, the outer yoke is folded back up. The seam is pulled open and the seam allowance pushed towards the back, towards the inside of the yokes. The outer yoke, which has already had the seam allowance folded over, should go very cleanly over the first yoke and cover the seam and seam allowances, with the outer yoke following the shoulder and neckline of the inner yoke. Top stitch the folded seam allowance to the fold. As this stitch is what is holding the yoke down, it needs to be as close to the fold as you can sew it. Just to neaten up, a stitch is done close to the remaining edges of the yoke at the neck and both armholes. It's a fairly loose stitch and quite close to the edge, so that it is not visible after the sleeves and the collar have been sewn on. Keeping these together makes it easier because we then do not have to keep track of the layer underneath as we're folding, since it's essentially basted together. I'll mention again later, but at this stage, depending on the type of hem you have, the bottom edges can be sewn now, separately before the side seams are done. The sleeve needs to have the gauntlet line copied onto both pieces. Since this line will be lost completely when finished, I can use thread to tell me where the line is so that I can copy it onto the other sleeve. From here, the gauntlet is made up. My way of doing it, I have the templates cut. The pieces go onto the sleeve with the right side of the pieces stitched to the wrong side of the sleeve. The larger piece goes on the side further from the sleeve seam. The short rectangular edge of the piece needs to go on the line of the sleeve. The rectangular piece is on the side close to the sleeve seam. I usually offset the smaller piece so that it hangs beyond the sleeve a little bit. Using pins on the seam allowance of each piece to hold it there for your viewing benefit. I mark 1 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch from the top of the larger piece to tell me where to stop sewing. This point is even on both pieces of the gauntlet. Then again, for viewing benefit, I chalk on the seam allowance that I want to vaguely follow when sewing them on, crossing at the intersections where it needs to be back-tacked. At the machine, following the lines I've quite thoroughly marked, the seam allowance doesn't wholly matter. It can be 1/4 of an inch or a centimeter. The back tack, though, does need to be very even. Once machined, the line on the sleeve needs to be cut down the middle of the 2 stitches. Like a welt pocket, a mitre needs to be cut at the end. Stopping cutting 1 centimeter or so shy of the ends of the stitches and cut diagonally to where each stitch is back-tacked. There are a few ways this can be pressed. I'll just go through 2 different orders that it can be done, but you should really pick one way and just do that every time. First way could be press over the small piece, flip the sleeve over and pull it to the right side of the cloth. Fold the other raw edge towards the seam allowance, pressing that too. Fold it down the middle and press it one last time, basically jetting or binding the edge. Fold the larger gauntlet piece to the right side of the sleeve. Pulling the seam flat, press that now. The opposite edge folding over a 1 centimeter seam allowance, or folding over 1 seam allowance. It's easy to do if the template was made with a 1 centimeter 3/8 seam allowance, so that I can fold 1 centimeter, it's just a larger amount and easier to fold. Folding that new edge just over the seam. Finally, the raw edges at the top are folded over as well. I just want to cut a little bit of the small piece off so that it ends underneath the bigger piece. Also, the mitre needs to be folded up onto the right side of the sleeve, but that happened automatically this time. Method 2 is the same result, just a different order, which will hopefully help by offering an alternative perspective. Again, cutting the seam and the mitre, starting this time folding the seam of the larger piece inwards, working around the piece, folding the top edges inwards, pressing the whole thing over the seam allowance. Folding it onto the right side of the sleeve. Folding the small piece over the seam, flipping it to the front, checking the mitre is also folded upwards at this moment. Folding the seam of the raw edge and then folding it over the seam allowance in one go to bind the raw edge that it's covering. Folding the big piece in half, covering its seam allowance and stitching. Before top stitching, just to make things easy, I'm marking where the top of the stitching was, basically across where the mitre was folded so that it's stitched most securely. Starting with the small side, top stitching the edge. Just past the original stitching, and it can be back tacked, it doesn't need to be. The big piece, starting from the cuff down the first edge, turning at the corner to the point. It's important that the seam allowance is stitched underneath the gauntlet, turning up the other edge, making sure the end of the sleeve is closed together, stitching across the mark. Turning back down towards the point, making a few stitches so that I can avoid having to back tack, checking that the mitre is caught in the final stitch across. Snipping the threads away, the gauntlet of the sleeve is prepared until I'm ready to sew the armhole seam, which I will do after preparing the collar. Though the armhole is often sewn before the side seam and sleeve seam, sometimes they are sewn first and then the armhole seam is sewn, where the sleeve is sometimes pitched forwards, rotated in the armhole so that it sits slightly forwards, like people's arms naturally do. My interfacing is dry and hopefully that's taken out any shrinkage, which a couple washes later it seems to have successfully done so that should be more stable now. To make the collar, I'm making full use of the interfacing, sewing the collar stay pockets straight onto it. Use either one of the 4 pieces. Make a line that bisects the 2 edges from the point of the collar. On that line, the width and height of the collar stay need to be marked as well. The width line towards the center front of the fall needs to be marked diagonally towards the corner of the collar. The line should end on the top edge of the fall and not be on the short side at the front of the collar. The other line towards the center back of the collar can be carried on straight to the neck edge of the fall, where the seam with the stand will be. Either side of the center marks measure 5 centimeters, 2 inches, and cut that center section out. It's the same for the collar stay pockets on both sides. We need to cut halfway between the last 2 marks to the point they intersect. Then the 2 pieces are folded along the recently mentioned lines to the point that they were cut to, and along the raw edge towards the middle of the collar. Essentially, it needs top stitching along both remaining edges of the collar stay and the folded edges to create the shape of the stay pockets. So for each piece of cloth, it's 2 straight stitches and 1 on a corner, as vaguely marked there with chalk. At the machine, it doesn't really make sense doing 3 separate stitches, so I do 1 stitch and sew along the seam allowance of the fall of the collar to where the next stitch starts, and then the next one, sewing both pieces down. With the stay pockets sewn down, I just grabbed the other piece of the fall and placed it right side to right side with the piece I just made, sewing around it with the appropriate seam allowance. In this case, the second piece of the fall comes out a little longer than the canvas piece. I think I accidentally stretched it, so I just follow the edge of the canvas piece and cut down the outside of the fall afterwards. It needs to be pressed, and then the seam allowance beyond the tips need to be trimmed off so that it can be folded out more neatly. Pressing open the seam makes it much easier to turn through afterwards. To thoroughly press it at the tips, I start with roughly opening the seam allowance on both sides of the corner. When they're mostly open, separating the layers of the collar on the inside and folding it such that the seams are on top of each other. Careful that the seam allowances are still open, pressing the collar flat like that as well. This will create creases on the inside and outside of the collar fall, but those can be quite easily pressed out later. I should have spent twice the amount of time that I did on pressing the seams open, because the better they're pressed, the better the finish will be. The process would also have been much easier with an edge board, but I'm getting by. With the whole perimeter well pressed, it can be bagged out. Anything that you like to do. The professionals literally have this whole piece of equipment set into a table to turn out corners like this, but we have to make do. I have a pair of what are not exactly forceps, but forceps would have been better for this. Grab into the point of the collar and push it through to turn the collar out. The forceps can be taken out, and I have an orange stick which is good for pushing points out. But not exactly pushing, because that could break the cloth and leave a hole, more so massaging the point out. With both tips out, the collar should be pressed flat, with the inside and the outside laying very even against the seam. In shirts, the seam shouldn't be shifted towards the front or the back. The better the seam is pressed, the more naturally it will sit in half, making it easier to press flat. The collar needs to be top stitched around the three edges now. Usually you see it about as wide as the seam allowance, but what I did here is stitch around the edge, just because that's what I wanted. The fall is finished, so the stand can be built now. Taking the two pieces of the stand, one should have the seam allowance pressed up to the wrong side of the cloth along the edge, and it will be sewn to the shirt. Start with the stand interfacing, since I want the interfacing to be on the outside facing piece of the collar. Place the stand that wasn't pressed onto the canvas, and the fall with the outside facing up onto that. It's important that the center marks are all together. Lastly, the stand that was ironed placed right side to right side on the collar, lining up the seams. I'm placing a pin in the seam allowance at the center mark, just to preserve that for the moment as I move to the sewing machine. Tracing the seams together from the center marks to the side I want to begin machining. Starting below the seam allowance that's folded up, sewing the seam between the different layers. Approaching the start of the fall of the collar, checking that it is lined up with the seams of the stand before sewing them all together. Working across, it's the same idea, getting to the other side of the fall, sewing the stand across the seam that's been folded. It can be worth checking that the stitching has actually caught through, especially on either side of the fall. At the curves or the corners, the seam allowance could be trimmed so that the collar can be folded out most neatly. In a lot of cases, it can just be turned out, the seam pulled to the edges and pressed. After which, the fall can be folded and pressed over to give us the shape of the collar. That is then ready to put onto the shirt. I have the simplest possible cuffs. First thing I do is press up a seam allowance on the bottom edge of the left and right side, remembering that I have one smaller and one larger. With the seam pressed, I want to recut the interfacing so that it doesn't have the extra seam allowance along the bottom, making it shorter. I'm placing the canvas into the seam allowance onto the wrong side of the cuff cloth. With that, I'm machining across the seam allowance to fasten the seam and to trap the interfacing in place. Still at the machine, taking the other piece of each, placing them right side to right side and machining them with the appropriate seam allowance for the pattern piece. Away from the machine, pressing the cuffs before trimming the seam allowance off around the corners so that it turns out more easily. I doubt the seam allowance could be pressed open effectively enough to make the turning easier, so I don't even bother. Turning the cuff out and pulling the seam to the edge all the way around, pressing it like that. The cuff won't be French seamed until it is sewn to the sleeve. As alluded to earlier, the sleeve seam and side seam can be sewn separately before sewing the sleeve into the armhole. It can be easier to sew the four seams separately, but I think the armhole seam is much easier to sew first. Sewing separately though allows for the sleeve to be pitched forwards, so instead of hanging parallel to the body, the sleeve comes forward in front of it slightly, just like most people's arms naturally do. First thing to sew the armhole is to iron the armhole seam of the sleeve. I'm folding over about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch onto the right side of the cloth. Doing this first step makes it much easier to sew the 2 stitches involved in sewing the armhole seam in one sitting. Get the shirt out and lay it flat so that we can assign each sleeve to each armhole seam correctly. Again, the gauntlet or placket in the sleeve is towards the back of the shirt. The half of the sleeve with the gauntlet should be on the yoke and the back of the shirt, while the clean front half of the sleeve should be on the shirt front's armhole. At this moment of writing, I remember that in production sewing, the rear of the armhole and crown of the sleeve have 2 notches and the fronts have a single notch to help match the seams. Said notches, I have never heard a glancing remark or reference to them in bespoke shirting. Depending on the pattern you have, I may not have needed to go into such detail about which way around the sleeve goes in. Before going to the machine, it is worth starting from one side and fingering the seams together to check that they are in fact balanced and can be sewn together neatly. If they don't start and end correctly at the side seam, then it's potentially a pattern issue. If it's too large, then a quick fix is to cut down both sides equally, half the amount that it's too large by. The same idea if the side seam extends more than the sleeve, but check the seam very carefully before cutting anything off. With the correct sleeve on the correct side of the shirt, the seams need to go together right side to right side, lining them up at the side seams. The shirt will go through the machine with the body of the sleeve on the outside so that the seam will be on the right both times, the right hand side both times. The seam will be started on the front on one side and the back on the other. Bringing the first sleeve to the machine, the raw edges are placed just touching each other, but they shouldn't overlap, right sides together. It should be sewn with the folded edge of the sleeve a good centimeter, or rather 1/2 inch, seam allowance. Pressing the sleeve first made this much easier, because it was flat and it's easier to position the body relative to the sleeve seam. A good sleeve pattern should almost be perfectly net with the whole body. There should be no need to ease or stretch the seam into it, though it can be a challenge to keep both pieces of cloth flat in the machine without trapping any kinks or pleats in the seam. At the end of the seam, take it out and take a look at the seam from the right side of the cloth to see that the seam has been sewn neatly. Both of the armhole seams can be sewn first, or the 2 stitches for the sleeve can be sewn first, it doesn't really matter. Making the second stitch is much more easy if the sleeve crown was pressed and prepared already. The sleeve needs to be pulled away from the body and the fold on the seam allowance needs to be pushed upwards onto the body of the shirt. This is hiding all of the raw edges so that if the pieces were prepared and the first stitch done correctly, it should be very difficult to make this stitch wrong. Before the second stitch, the seam could be ironed in the position with the sleeve and body apart and the seam allowance pressing up into the body. This just makes the stitch more comfortable to sew because the seam doesn't have to be pulled apart while sewing the seam. If electing against pressing now, then placing the armhole seam underneath the machine again. with the sleeve towards the inside of the machine. The stitch is on the fold of the sleeve that was ironed over originally. I don't know how clear the fact that my knuckles are white from pulling the sleeve and body apart, making really sure the seam is fully pulled open on the outside before it is stitched over. Going up over the seam should be very easy. The cloth should be very net and should just sit over the body of the shirt. Going over the crown, there may be a small amount of fullness or excess in the folded edge of the sleeve. It needs to be prevented from folding over itself as it gets pulled under the machine, so use something with a fine tip to distribute the excess and push a little under the presser foot as the seam is sewn over the shoulder of the armhole. Going back down the other side of the seam, it should be very even again and simple to sew. One other thing to note is that while sewing over the yoke, there is an extra layer of cloth that needs to be folded over the body of the shirt, basically. It means that it can be slightly more difficult to make sure the seam is fully pulled or pressed open. This is potentially only an issue with thicker cloths like the denim. The lighter the cloth, the less of an issue the yoke may present, but it's worth pointing out. At the end of the seam, no big need to back tack, top stitching the other sleeve in much the same way. Last thing, just to check from the outside of the sleeve, looking at the seam to see that it has been fully pulled open and there isn't any excess cloth between the first stitch and the top stitch. If there is, then at least that section of top stitching has to be removed and replaced, making sure the seam is fully pulled open. As suggested earlier, the side seam and sleeve seam can be done before the armhole seam, but the method would be the same as is for sewing both. Similar to the armhole seam, beginning by pressing over a small seam on the right side of the shirt. Usually the front body of the shirt is pressed over because of how the seam wants to look when finished, but there isn't a functional difference if the back were pressed over instead. The edge is pressed over across the armhole and the sleeve is also pressed over the same amount all the way to the cuff. And basically typically it's as small as possible, but I can only realistically get to about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch. Press over both seams and then the back and fronts are placed right sides together. The sleeves are going to follow and end up folded in half, and the seams will go together as well. Going to the machine, I prefer to start at the armhole seam and go down the side seam or the sleeve seam as appropriate. Starting at the armhole seam means that it can be lined up perfectly most easily. With the seam that was folded on the machine, on the bed of the machine, with the right sides of the cloth facing upwards and the right side of the other piece facing down onto the cloth, positioning the armhole seams on top of each other. Positioning the raw edge of the shirt on top, inside of the fold of the seam, so that it is sitting into the crease. They are machined just next to the raw edge of the piece that was folded over on top. As the seam is sewn, continue to position the seam allowance on top into the folded seam, and use the raw edge on top now as a guide to sew the seam. The seam allowance should then be about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch, but it can be smaller depending on how finely the seam is folded over, or how finely you can fold the seam over. It could also be larger depending on the seam allowance of the pattern if 1/4 inch is too difficult. Finishing the first seam, On the other side, the seam will need to be started at the bottom of the side seam or the bottom of the sleeve. Therefore, the seam needs to be traced from the armhole down the seam to make sure it matches on the way back up to the armhole and doesn't create any fullness. At the bottom where it's started, position the edges in just the same way and sew back towards the armhole, overlapping the original stitches so that I can avoid any back tacking. Going to the other side of the shirt, I can do the same thing, but the order of the seams should be backwards. Opening up the seam and turning the sleeve right side out just to check the seam is neat from the outside. And considering I'm not totally sure how the armhole seam wound up not aligned properly twice, but the ends of the seams line up, so I must have done something correctly. Each seam needs to be top stitched, theoretically one from the hem and the other from the sleeve cuff. They could both be sewn from one side, so I will illustrate both here. With the front and back body of the shirt opened up, the seam allowances just need to be pushed down to one side such that the raw edges are all tucked away and the folded edge is laying on top of the body of the shirt. Like the armhole, the folded edge is machined along the seams. Same as the armhole, I could have taken this away and pressed it over, which can make it more comfortable, only because it would not have... I would not have to pull it apart as it's being sewn. Otherwise, the body of this seam is a very simple affair, though it is definitely worth checking that there is plenty of thread left in the bobbin before beginning this stitch, because it is not a place that you would want to run out at any point. Getting to the armhole seam, it is very easy to sew across, even in this denim, which might be the heaviest reasonable cloth to use. There aren't too many layers of cloth because the seam was flat-felled with the layers offset from each other rather than overlapping, like the seam currently being sewed. As the sleeve seam gets top-stitched, the sleeve is gradually wrapping around the presser foot mechanism of the machine. This is fine, except it takes away the mobility of the shirt and the seam. There's less and less of the sleeve that can be easily pulled to top stitch the seam. It just means it takes a little longer and it needs to be sewn a little more carefully. We still need to keep in mind that the cloth seam needs to be pulled open, and it's also more likely that cloth will end up underneath the seam and get sewn down with the stitch to the sleeve. This operation is much more easy with the wider the sleeve because it gives us more space to work in. The whole time I'm keeping my hands inside of the machine, pressing the cloth into the table of the machine to both pull pull the seam open and feel through the cloth to make sure that no other fabric goes under the needle. At this moment, I'll reiterate that these seams you really do not want the bobbin to run dry. Check there's plenty, and if there isn't more than enough, switch it out for one with more. At the end of the sleeve, just run the seam off and the sleeve can be pulled out from around the vertical mechanism of the machine to check the seam that it's been done correctly and neatly. The other side seam, sleeve seam, can be done in the same way, but the alternative is to start with the sleeve inside of the machine mechanism. The sleeve needs to be bundled up so that it's just a hole and slid under the presser foot. It's rotated around so that the seam is coming out from the front of the machine and it can start being sewn from the cuff. Much the same, pulling the seam apart, pushing the seam allowance over to one side and sewing on the folded edge. Equally important, feeling through the cloth to make sure no extra layers of cloth get sewn down as the top stitch is being sewn. It's a small labour doing the top stitching in the sleeve. You have to take care, but starting from the cuff it gets easier and easier rather than harder and harder. Otherwise, it's the same as the first seam, just the other way around. Trimming the threads, and we can move on to the next steps. Firstly, I want to verify that the collar is the correct size for the shirt neck, marking the center points on the shirt and the collar, running the seam together in my fingers carefully to check that they will sew together. I'm not sure what's going on here, but the collar works out in the end anyway. The center doesn't need to be pinned or to start at the center points, because if it is checked sufficiently, the stitch can start from one side and it will line up the whole way across. The seam that was folded when the collar was made could be used as a guide for the seam allowance. Otherwise, the raw edges of the neck should go together and be sewn with a normal seam allowance as decided by the pattern. Importantly, back tack on both sides so that it's easiest to open the seam and push the seam allowances into the collar. If the collar is sufficiently well sewn, then the placket inlay can be removed. The corner of the seam could also be trimmed slightly to allow the finished seam to sit a little more flat. We can start the top stitch or French seam from most anywhere. From the middle, I'm pulling the folded piece from earlier over the stitch holding the collar, beginning a stitch along the fold. Always pulling the seams fully open, and because it's a top stitch, the stitch length should be more narrow than the stitches that sewing seams. At the front edges of the collar, it can become a little more difficult to sew due to the overlapping layers. It needs to be sewn up to the edge before changing direction to sew the perimeter of the collar stand. Slightly past the fall of the collar, the stitch is generally shifted away from the edge and is sewn about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch from the edge where the fall comes out. I expect that it is simply more easy to sew the seam a little way from the edge along this part of the collar. Just before getting to the other side of the fall, beginning to stitch at the very edge of the stand again. Keeping the seam allowance open, as always, and pressed up into the collar, heading back to where the stitch began, overlapping slightly to avoid backtacking. There was potentially some ease in the seam that was being sewn down, so I used a fine pointed tool to help evenly distribute it under the presser foot so that it doesn't kink or pleat when I hit the beginning of the stitch. First thing I'm doing is checking that I have the left and right cuff, which will not be the last time I check which is left and right. It depends which side the wearer wears their watch on, so it's unhelpful to go into detail in this matter. I'm doing things slightly out of order here, but I am marking about 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch, from the raw edge of the cuff. Because this pattern has a 2.5 centimeter, 1 inch seam allowance on the cuff. It's supposed to be marked on the inside, but whatever. Depending on the cloth, it cannot be marked with anything too bold. On this cloth, using chalk is easy, but a fine shirting cloth, potentially a light pencil, as you might have used for striking, would be good. At this point, I need to press the sleeve to give me the crease that I can use for putting the pleat into the sleeve for the cuff. My method of pressing the sleeve starts at the sleeve seam. I fold the seam over the first machine stitch where the two sides were initially sewn together. Due to the flat filled seam, the sleeve can be folded along the seam in two main ways. I always fold on the join of the seam rather than beside the top stitch for consistency. Like folding a map. This way I always get the sleeve crease in the same place, which has me pondering why are these two creases so important in menswear. Anyway, same idea with both sleeves, but we may as well make the most of pressing the cuff, especially because this is the last time it can be pressed flat. With this method, I need to flip the sleeves inside out and mark the 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 seam on the inside of the sleeve. I'm placing the cuff against the inside of the sleeve with the seam allowance facing away from the sleeve so that it can be sewn down. Trust me here. This is the seam allowance, so it's fine to go get a pin to hold the edges together as the pleats get folded in. All that really needs to happen is for the end of the sleeve to be sewn into the smaller circumference of the cuff. I will just outline the one that I like most. In many bespoke shirts I've seen, they place a small pleat between the small piece of the gauntlet and the sleeve seam. I'm pinning it to keep it in place before putting the other pleat in. Aligning the other side of the cuff to the other side of the gauntlet, pinning it there so that I can get a measure of the other pleat that I need to put in. I use the crease as the fold of the pleat and point towards the large gauntlet piece. It may have to be finessed to pull out all the excess cloth in the sleeve, pinning it down as well. Same for the other cuff. Something I do after taking out the small pleat is placing another pin a little further across the cuff between the crease and the sleeve seam, just to make it easier to find how much bigger the sleeve is than the cuff and how much needs to be pleated. Just as a note, the cuff should overhang the sleeve on both edges by the smallest possible amount. Or not overhang, but the cuff cannot be sitting inside of the gauntlet pieces, since the seams need to be folded upwards into the cuff. At the machine, using the fold as a guide for the seam allowance, just making the stitch straight across, keeping the raw edges of the cuff against the seam that was marked on the sleeve. Back tack both sides like the collar. This time, nothing should really need to be trimmed down. The seam needs to be pulled open, and the seams can be pushed into the cuff. Pulling the folded edge over the top, it should be pulled down so that it covers the stitching that was just made. The fold needs to be machined along the edge, backtacking and starting sewing across, and backtacking the other side as well to finish. At this point, the cuff can be French seamed, usually with a 1/2 centimeter, 1/4 inch seam. Specifically, I'm starting this stitch a little away from the 2 stitches currently in the cuff, just because this is a possible style and it works with this method. Backtacking to start and sewing around. Backtacking at the end about the same distance from the horizontal stitches so that it ends the way it started. And I'll be real, this is the neatest cuff I've done, and the first time I've used this method. It was surprisingly neat on the inside as well. The point of this method is that the outside is very neat, and the inside could be a little bit crusty, but I think I got the best of both this time. The last portion of the making stage is the hem. I want to change the hem here, so I'm taking it away to check the hem that I want. There's a curved hem on this shirt, so the hem should have been put up already, and it could have had a gusset piece put onto the bottom of the side seam to strengthen it, and allows the maker to show off an example of hand stitching. I want to make a speed hem, so I'm cutting the shape and giving an extra inlay to make it easier to sew, a couple of centimeters or so. Either way though, the back should hang lower than the front and the hem should curve upwards to the side seam, but that is more a pattern choice. The seam I have in the end is very shallow here, but a more shallow hem is much easier to follow. I'm going to make this hem with 2 stitches here to make it the easiest and finest hem I've sewn. It will be folded once and machined, and then folded again to hide the raw edge and machined again. Essentially, I am folding and ironing the hem by the amount that I had left when I cut it to size. With regard to the placket, it can usually just be folded up like normal, but given how I've done it, I can unfold the placket and fold it up like that, which gives me a cleaner finish. At the placket again, I can cut some of the excess that was folded when making the placket, but it can come down to the specific method of sewing the placket that you use. I'll take this to the machine and make a stitch right at the edge where the cloth is folded, using a narrow stitch length here. Theoretically, a finer needle and a finer thread can make sewing these very narrow hems easier. Just stitch the whole way across before going back to the board. The stitch could be pressed flat here, but all that needs to happen is the excess cloth beyond the stitch needs to be trimmed away. The closer the cut to the stitching and the closer the stitching is to the fold means the hem will be finer. Again, due to the placket I made, I can keep the placket unfolded, fold the hem up the second time, and then fold the placket back over, which gives me a very clean finish. After back tacking on the placket, continuing around the hem, folding up the edge a second time. This is very easy to fold up and feed it through the machine. Typically the plackets will be asymmetrical, but in my case I made them the same way so that they can be finished in the same way. Potentially the hem could do with a press at this point, but it would do just as well to press it with the top press. I'll mark the buttonholes and button stand. On a men's shirt, the buttons go on the right hand side of the shirt, so the buttonholes are on the left hand side. At the collar, the buttonhole is halfway between the top and bottom, and 1.2 centimeters, half an inch, from the front edge. It may be different based on patterns, but this is a good rule to start with. The holes need to be a bare 1.2 centimeters, bare inch, wide to fit the buttons into. 1.1 millimeters or 3/8 of an inch is too small. The first button on the placket is often 5 centimeters, 2 inches below the neckline, but it can be stylistic or informed by the pattern. The buttonholes down the placket are parallel to the edge, and it depends on the width of the placket, because the hole needs to go halfway across the placket. In my case, that is 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch from the edge, because it is a 3 centimeter, 1¼ inch placket. The distance between the buttons can be informed by the pattern. It'll be around 9 to 12 centimeters between each one. The buttons shouldn't necessarily be more than 8 inches below the waist, because bespoke shirts are longer than we are generally used to. I can fit 5 buttons onto this placket. In hindsight, I did over-shorten it. The bottom button should be horizontal, which I suspect gives the wearer more flexibility around the seat. On the opposite side, the buttons go in just the same places. On the collar, the button is just 1.2 centimeters, half an inch from the front edge, and the buttons on the placket are the same distance from the edge as the buttons. And the buttons on the placket are the same distance from the edge as the buttonholes. How the buttons and buttonholes go onto the cuff depend fully on the style of the cuff, though the buttons and buttonholes should be 1.2 centimeters, half an inch from the edge as informed by the pattern. I can only use chalk here and be so clumsy with it because of the cloth. A proper shirting should be marked much more carefully and subtly so as to not leave marks on the finished product. Anyone can sew on a button, and there are resources on hand sewing shirt buttonholes, but nearly all bespoke shirts have buttonholes sewn by machine. There is an interesting difference between normal industrial production shirt buttonholes and bespoke and London made-to-measure shirt buttonholes that I feel like I've noticed in some cases. I think the machines are just much older, or perhaps classic. Anyway, I'm folding the shirt for no particular reason, just this is my method, but I'm not going to go through it in much detail. This is almost twice as long as my quote-unquote university thesis. Anyway, this is my current workflow and method of shirt making. It is much better informed this time, and I hope people can find a lot of use out of it. Again, pick and choose what methods you want to follow. Not that I'm in a position to force anybody into anything. I am simply here to offer as much insight as I can for those that want it.